Hello and welcome again to the programme which brings together distinguished British commentators and foreign correspondents who write, blog, podcast and broadcast from the Dateline London. It's been a week for recalling the world's unfinished business. Sectarian violence on city streets in Iraq, a country which has endured nearly 20 years of instability. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, buried this weekend in the Russia that emerged from its wreckage, but whose present leader still seems to yearn for its past. And the British are still waiting for a new Prime Minister. In the studio to discuss all that, Bronwyn Maddox, Director and Chief Executive of Chatham House, an independent organisation which under its Royal Charter exists to advance the sciences of international politics, economics and jurisprudence. The charter dates from 1926, Bronwyn Maddox from last month, but her appointment is the culmination of a distinguished career reporting the world. Michael Goldfarb has been a foreign correspondent for NPR, National Public Radio, in the United States. His podcast is The First Rough Draft of History. The latest episode features the story of Mikhail Gorbachev. And Stephanie Bolson is UK and Ireland correspondent for the German media group Die Welt, including for its newspaper of the same name, a paper established in Hamburg by the British Army of Occupation 1 month after Winston Churchill delivered his speech warning that an Iron Curtain was descending and dividing Europe. Talk about unfinished business. Bronwyn, let's begin though with the unfinished business of the choice of a new Prime Minister. I mean, it is almost finished. The voting is over. They've got to do the counting. We'll know on Monday whether it's Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak. Do you think it's been at all illuminating about what we can expect from what's likely to be thought to be a Truss government?
And I think it does seem that Liz Truss has got it. It would be quite a shock given all the polling we've had so far. So let's kind of talk on that basis. Yes. I think we've learned quite a lot. We haven't learned some central things like what she might do to support people through the cost of living crisis that were there, but we've learned quite a lot of important fragments, a pretty uncompromising position, no surprise there, towards Europe and the Northern Ireland Protocol, that word from the past that is still with us, that she wants to have defence spending at 3%, that we don't know where the money's coming, that she may declare China a threat. That, I mean, the phrase that probably resonates over her whole campaign, that she would, it's the jury's out on whether or not France and President Macron are friend or foe, which rather alarmed friends and foes of Britain all round. So I think we've learned some fragments, but we've also learned something about her style. She really prides herself on being a disruptor, but in a very disrupted world. It's really hard to work out what that is going to mean.
That's going to be particularly interesting for the so-called special relationship. I hate to use the phrase because every country likes to talk about its special relationship with the United States. But Michael, I mean, she did say that through all the busy, big, huge, bulging intro she's going to have when she becomes Prime Minister next Tuesday, she's going to make time for a call to the White House for a conversation with Joe Biden. How enthusiastic do you think the administration will be about taking that call?
Well, I don't think they have a problem with it. I mean, in the 25 years we've been doing this program, every time there's a new British Prime Minister, it's about the call to. And I wouldn't mind if she was seen walking down the colonnades on the backside of the White House, taking the elbow of Joe Biden as they step down that step, the way Theresa May did with Donald Trump, who seemed to have a hard time finding where the next step was. But seriously, I think that they have one thing to talk about, and Bronwyn mentioned it in her opening remarks. The Northern Ireland Protocol is something that concerns not just Joe Biden, because he's Irish, American, but also Congress. And so that will be a key topic. But the other thing is, look, it is a time of crisis. And the last thing that an American president wants is to have his core alliance, which is with Europe, splitting apart over trade issues and kind of foolishness. You know, is Macron friend or foe? Don't play these kinds of games for domestic politics with diplomacy. I don't think Macron takes it seriously, to be honest. And I think that's what they will talk about. But whether that call happens on Wednesday or 3 weeks from Wednesday, because he's got a pretty full in tray, is not clear.
Stephanie, one thing she has been explicit about, and a lot of people have been kind of critical of a lack of detail, particularly on the cost of living questions and helping with energy bills. Liz Truss has been explicit because she was asked this and saying there will be no, she was asked at the last hustings, there will be no rationing of energy this winter. The debate is somewhat different in Germany, because they've been talking about rationing at least since the summer.
Yeah, and I actually happened to attend that very last hustings here in London, and I was surprised when she said that, because I just come back from Germany where all the talk is about rationing, and actually we have the breaking news that Nord Stream 1 will not deliver any more gas. So it is really urgent in Germany. And in fact, already in the spring there was a gas emergency plan being launched. The government has also introduced legislation, and for example in public buildings the temperature has to go down to 19 Celsius, no more public lightnings of monuments and so on. And talking to people in Germany, it's all they talk about. It's about cold showers. I mean, in the summer it's quite nice, but cold showers in the winter is going to be hard. But 20% of energy needs to be saved, actually, to compensate the delivery that is not coming from Russia anymore. It's going to be very, very tough.
It's hard not, Bronwyn, to draw the parallels, although obviously there are enormous differences, about the energy shocks that we went through in the 1970s. I mean, I was listening to a woman on the radio reminiscing about the fact that she had 3 hours of electricity and then 3 hours off and then 3 hours on again in that sort of 73, 74.
All right, I was one of the, school books by candlelight brigade. Yeah.
But it's just like we're not talking about this. We're not even engaging with the question.
We're beginning to. We're beginning to engage with it, at least with the cost of the sheer cost of it, and that is where you can feel the fear in British politics and other countries at the moment. But you begin to see, just bringing in what Michael said about the Northern Ireland Protocol, you begin to see the cost of that is squeezing out all these other discussions about Ukraine, about what on earth Europe, and I include in that Britain, are going to do about their future energy supplies. And I think Britain really has something to bring on that, but we've got tied up in some of these old arguments as well.
And it's presumably the kind of thing that could, in theory, provide a tremendous bond, or kind of re-establish the bond between the UK and Europe. I mean, given that she's been a disruptor, is it possible that this is one of the things she will choose to disrupt? In other words, the hostility. She might say, actually, that's very old government. I want to be fresh and new, and I, because of my reputation, because of where I've positioned myself, I'm the person who could rebuild those links.
She could, and I think there is a huge opportunity for Britain at this point, outside the EU, to start, at this moment of crisis, to start talking to the EU about energy, about migration, about science, about all these things, and Britain's really in a good position for that. But then you come back to these words, at the Northern Ireland, the bitterness of that, the legislation that, as far as we know, Liz Truss very much backs, very controversial legislation, about to come back to the House of Lords in early October. And until she has settled that, all this other stuff isn't accessible. And as far as we know, she is going to take a very uncompromising line, which could actually pitch us into much worse relations with the EU.
And I think the coalition will also be very uncompromising, because they are looking at Britain and they are not so sure how long will she be there. So since Brexit happened, there have been 3 prime ministers. So why would they agree on something of a deal if they don't know how long she's going to stay?
A really good point.
Let's move on to talk about Ukraine, if we can. Stephanie, what do you think is the potential significance of this offensive around Kherson? Is it strategically significant, or is it as much as anything about morale?
I think it's both, and it's strategically important because if the Ukrainian army troops succeed in taking or getting Kherson back, which I think it's not very likely to happen very quickly, but they are making very slow progress. So on the one hand, it's morally very important for the Ukrainians, but also I think strategically it's to show that thanks to the weapon deliveries and the equipment that is now deployed, the Ukrainians are very smart, they're using it, and they're driving the Russian forces back. And the Russian forces have suffered significant losses. So, it's on both accounts, it's a very important thing to watch, but it's going to, they say they want to grind down the Russian troops in Kherson, and it's going to take a very, very long time.
This is, the perspective seems to be, Michael, that this is not quite a war of attrition, but it's certainly a war that has reached a point which we can expect little progress for quite a long time.
Well, yes. And this, we also have to remember the weather, which we're in the first week of September, and by the end of October, things become a bit more difficult for taking ground, even in the southern part of Ukraine. It still feels like attrition. I know that Sir Lawrence Friedman, who I follow religiously, and people who watch the program should look him up. military security analyst doesn't see this going on for years and years. He's just it's a stalemate, and it will ultimately and sooner rather than later be negotiated out. But it is incredibly important to take as much territory on the far side of the Dnieper in that area, heading towards Kherson city. They're in Kherson Oblast for, as Stephanie says, morale, if nothing else, and to get that territory captured before the really bad weather makes any kind of on-the-ground fighting impossible.
It's more than just morale, isn't it? It's more than symbolic. They are having a real disruptive effect on Russia, but I'd still find it hard to call it strategic in the sense that it's a counter-offensive. They're not going to get very far.
But the other thing is that there is an urgency as well. We have to remember is Russia keeps starting to hold these plebiscites to ratify new Russian-dominated governments in the area, and I think they're trying to disrupt that and make it seem like you can hold an election if you like, Putin, but we're just 10 kilometers up the road and we're coming. And this will be a disrupting effect on those planned elections.
I mean, I guess my question is what effect it might have on European morale and European solidarity over the winter, and that is obviously one of the audiences they're playing for.
I mean, that's the big thing, isn't it?
A potentially rather fickle audience.
A very fickle audience, potentially even more fickle. I mean, there was a very interesting piece in The Economist last week, Stephanie, trying to assess the impact of sanctions and saying, yes, they have had an impact, and they will have an impact in maybe 2 or 3 years' time, a really dramatic impact. But that is not on its own going to be enough to get Russia to abandon its military operation.
Yes, of
now,
course.
if people are paying a huge price for it, I mean, I've asked this question repeatedly and perhaps rather predictably, but it is still a live question. Will the kind of unity hold in those circumstances?
Yes, of course, and you see it reflected in the polls. And you can, in Germany, the opinion was split. Of course, there was then support of delivering weapons. The sanctions, they take a very long time, and as you say, now with the gas or with other effects on the German economy, on jobs,
yes,
on how people's standard of living, how they can get over the winter. But at the same time, I mean, you look at Austria, for example. There, the polls are also going in the opposite direction of saying now, sit down and negotiate. And if you look at the British government, they are saying this is not what should be done right now, because Putin must be clearly in the position of losing that war, and then only negotiations can start.
So somehow you have to create a situation where Ukraine is negotiating from a position of strength, not because of the weakness of its allies.
Yes. That feels... I'm not going to call it wishful thinking, but a nice bit of improvisation. I don't think whether...
No, we may never get there. But I was very struck, Stephanie, by the speech of Robert Habeck. I think it was a speech on the interview he gave this week, in which he said, what's fueled German prosperity, in effect, a couple of decades of cheap Russian energy, has gone for now and may never come back. I mean, the actual kind of one of the kind of cornerstones of the German economic success, certainly that of the last couple of decades, it looks really in danger. I mean, that politically must be a highly risky moment for the government. Yeah,
and it's a fragile coalition already, only a year after forming or having elections in Germany. And also, but over Europe, I mean, it's not only Germany dependent on gas. If you look at Bulgaria, Romania, all these countries, it's a Zeitenwende, as Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor, said, a turning of time. And whether it's the economic model, whether it's peace and security, 24th of February has changed everything.
You know what I'd like your view on, Stephanie, is there's two worries. One is the increasingly present worry about the cost of energy and not having enough energy. But to what degree does the idea of this revanchist Russia pushing westward still inspire a bit of fear in Germany, but also in places like Romania and Bulgaria? And, well, we know how it is in Poland, where people are just, they're not having it. They are trying to drag the EU into a very strong sanctions position. But I wonder in Germany, which is obviously the key country here, if that balance still is, we can't allow Putin to just send tanks through another country and get 700 kilometers closer to our own borders, which was, I think, a view people had, 5 months ago.
I think there continues to be a certain complacency, and there is the idea this could never happen. And I think there's also a certain, I would almost call it arrogance towards the fears in Poland, the fears in the Baltic states, because there is, I wouldn't say a lack of empathy, but Germans simply cannot imagine that that might happen. It's been a time of peace
so
since 1945.
That is there, that is kind of set aside. I won't quite say dismissed, but it's just not.
Yeah, there's a kind of balance. What is more important? What's the priority now? The economic model and keeping jobs and the economy flowing are really a danger that feels quite hypothetical.
In that sense, all of this is kind of a reminder of the fact we're only sort of 30 odd years since the Soviet Union dissolved after 3/4 of a century. We saw the death this week of Mikhail Gorbachev. From Germany's point of view, Stephanie, how significant a figure was he, given that whole debate about German unification that people like Margaret Thatcher were dead set against?
Yeah, she was very critical of German reunification, but Mikhail Gorbachev was crucial. I mean, I was a teenager in those days, but I do remember the 40-year parades and festivities in East Berlin in October 1989, where he was there and did speeches and then allegedly said this sentence of who decides too late will be punished by life. So it was not quite what he said, but he basically came there and told the regime in East Berlin, you have to change or the people will make you change and you will not be long here anymore. So, and of course in November 89, there was the fear if the tanks would roll in, and they didn't. And that was
because
of course,
they had in Prague.
Yeah, they had in Prague. They had in Berlin in 1953.
You know,
okay, a long time ago. But
yes, of course.
Of course, there was a bit of the security to know Gorbachev will not turn aggressive to us because he said the opposite. So that was pivotal to the whole development.
And that seems to me his real significance, that he allowed, not maybe with joy, but allowed the dissolution of the Soviet Union and those countries to go away more or less peacefully. I know the whole project and the reforms he wanted did not happen quite as he wanted, and with much disillusionment on his part, including with the lack of support as he saw it from the West. But the fact is he allowed something enormous to happen, and that had enormous effect on modern Europe, as we can call it now, and could have had that effect on Russia. But I think the West in turn did not understand just how big a moment and how big the change would be for Russia itself. And so we had the mess and the kleptocracy of the Yeltsin years and so on. But as for what Gorbachev presided over, enormous.
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting things is that I don't think anyone was prepared, and certainly Gorbachev wasn't. I think he was prepared to let the Warsaw Pact loose.
Yep.
I don't think it was important to him. The economy in Russia needed attention. I say Russia in the Soviet Union. I do mean in the Soviet Union because he was a man of the Soviet Union. But the post-Gorbachev, which happened very quickly, I mean, he didn't expect to be the victim of a coup when he went on vacation in Crimea. And it was a very, very difficult time for him. And I think that no one has ever seen what happened to a society that's been a totalitarian society in which everyone is turned on everyone else. And you have this central KGB, NKVD, Cheka history where anybody at any time can be denounced and sent away. That suddenly that structure, political, economic, and social, disappears. I think it makes people a little crazy. And after a while, they begin to want the comfort of what was, even if what was really kind of awful. And I think that what happened post-Gorbachev in Russia was that people gravitated ultimately towards the strongman. The strongman being the guy who was in Berlin when he didn't send the tanks in, and not even as the head of the KGB station, but just a junior officer. And now he is one of the most important people in the world and a dictator, and trying to recreate a kind of cross between Tsarism and Stalinism and a cult of personality around himself. That's Vladimir Putin. And it seems that many in Russia are okay with that because the trauma And I don't know what the West could have done. I mean, in my podcast this week, Martin Walker, who wrote a biography of Gorbachev, said, well, we needed a Marshall Plan. But who knew in 1991, when there was a recession in America and in Britain, and actually in Western Europe, that what was needed was a Marshall Plan? Who knew that what was needed was maybe some outside governance to help people across? Instead, an alcoholic named Boris Yeltsin ran the country into the ground and gave it away.
Instead of the belief, it was very ideologically tinged on the West side that the free markets and would win, and would sort out Russia, and you just needed the anointing of a country within.
And instead, what happened was a form of asset stripping, not backed up by institution building,
which has laid the foundations for some of what we're seeing, as Michael's saying, some of what we're seeing in Ukraine and in Putin's reign, I guess you call it.
Yeah, just leaving that aside, let's talk about something else which is unfinished business. Michael, over to you, Iraq.
Yeah.
To what extent, I mean, this is a massive oversimplification, so shoot me down in flames if you like, but to what extent is what we saw this week, the violence, the power of the militias, a straightforward legacy of the way, not so much the invasion was conducted, but the occupation was conducted?
It's you can trace it all the way back. And when I was just talking about totalitarianism, the reason I can say that with real conviction is that I was in Mosul the day Saddam Hussein regime disappeared, and people were like walking around as if they were in hallucination. Yes. Adult people. I'm not talking about kids. I'm talking about people who had lived the previous decades under Saddam's rule, and they did not believe that he was gone. They actually didn't believe it. And there was never a plan, and it's been the curse of that country that America
but some of this goes back. I mean, you can't date it all to the invasion, the mistakes, and all this. It partly reflects the sheer complexity of Iraq, doesn't it?
Well,
some of this is Shia on Shia.
Yes, but
antagonism with a deeply worried Iran sitting there looking.
There was wonderful word, intelligentsia. There was an intelligentsia in Russia as well. They need help because most intellectuals want to read poetry and think about politics. They don't want to have to do politics. I think that if there had been a well-organized governance structure for the first 5 years after the overthrow of Saddam and easing the country towards some kind of political stability, we'd have been much better off. And that's what I'm talking about. Yes, the complexities of Iraqi society. So what we're seeing today, very specifically, is the Shia majority. Yes. There's basically two factions. And Iran has used to have its chips down on Muqtada al-Sadr, and Sadr said, no, I'm an Iraqi nationalist, and no, I will, and now they found other Shiite politicians to back, and that's what the fighting is about. There was an election 3-4 years ago, I think, and, they've never been able to seat that parliament. But my point is, and I do disagree with you, Bronwyn, these problems could have been put into less extreme, I think, if there had actually been governance as part of the post-Saddam.
Don't have time to disagree with Michael again.
Yes.
Because you can't 5 years, 6 years of this wonderful thing called governance. I've taken the jobs I've taken recently because if you don't have governance, you don't have anything. But you can't just wish it in for 5 years. This is a phenomenally complicated country, and to try and create a democracy or something that will allow the minorities there to be protected while the others win. You've got decades, generations of work there.
That's true.
All right, the 5 years were bad.
But the civil war that began at exactly the time that those horrible pictures came out of Abu Ghraib, and all those people who were in Abu Ghraib who then were sent into Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and that became ISIS, that's on America, I think, and the country's still recovering from that.
I'm not disputing that. I'm disputing the magical use of the word governance to solve the world's problems.
We've literally only got a minute or so left. I just want to flag up the Iran nuclear deal. We talked about this at the beginning of the year. We still don't appear to have got one, but nobody's walked away.
Nobody's walked away. You can't call that progress, but it's not bad. It may be within reach. A lot of this, though, depends on what happens in America.
Right.
And America is heading for a really unpredictable time, midterms, the Republic, anyway. But no one's walked away. So.
And that's the best hope in a lot of these situations. And
yeah.
Germany is still part of that process, along with the members of the UN, permanent members of the UN Security Council.
Yeah, and sometimes maybe it's good if there's not too much attention on these talks.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, there's plenty of us to have attention on. We'll have attention on more of it next week. For now, Bronwyn Maddox, Stephanie Bowles and Michael Goldfarb, thank you all very much. Thank you very much. More Dateline, same time next weekend. Do join us then. Meantime, goodbye.